We'd spoken of Moshe Kibbutz Torah Sinai. Moshe received the Torah at Sinai. So over here, Rabbeinu Yonah, in his commentary, cites the Midrash, the Gemara. What is the Torah comprised of? We know there are two parts to the Torah. There's what we call Torah Shebechsav. We have the written law, which we refer to as the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, 5 books of Moses. It begins with Bereshis in the Genesis, and ends with Deuteronomy, and it ends with the passing of Moshe Rabbeinu when he was buried on Har Nevo. That's the written law. Contained within these 5 books, in writing, we have 248 positive commandments mentioned and 365 negative commandments mentioned. Now, every word in the Torah, every letter is open for interpretation. If you look in the Sefer Torah, the letters of the Torah, many of them have crowns on them. Crowns.
Oh, good.
And these crowns are referred to in the Talmud as tagim. You know, in Hebrew, tag is a crown. But in English, a tagim, a tag, they're tagged. These letters are tagged. They're meaning some of them have 1 tag, 2 tags, 3 tags, 7 tags. But the tag is to indicate something. It's tagged. It's meant to indicate you must extrapolate certain laws from these tags, which is associated with that letter. The Hebrew language is called Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. It's not called Ivrit. It's called Lashon HaKodesh. Why is Hebrew called the holy tongue? So Nachmanides explains in his commentary on Bereshis, Genesis in the beginning, because the language of God is Hebrew. God created the world with Hebrew, with the language of Hebrew. So because it's the Creator's language, therefore it's called the Holy Tongue. Before the Tower of Babel, all humanity spoke Hebrew. The genesis of languages began with the Tower of Babel. The 70 families rebelled against God. They built this Tower of Babel. And the reason why it's Babel, because it was in Babylon. But the whole concept of babbling, in English, babble, he's babbling. Person speaks incoherently, he's babbling. Because God confused their languages, because they were only united because they spoke one language. So what did God do? God confused them. Each one all of a sudden didn't understand the other. Each one spoke another language. This was the beginning of language. Every family, the 70 root families, 70 root nations, each nation was given another language. They know, and as a result of that, their rebellion against God was disrupted, because each person saw things from a different vantage point. But Hebrew is called Lashon HaKodesh. It's the language which God created the world. We find the Talmud tells us that Tzalel, who was the nephew of Moshe Rabbeinu, oversaw the building of the Mishkan. What was the Mishkan? We explained many times, the Mishkan was a microcosm of existence. Whatever was needed to bring about existence, creation, the Mishkan was a microcosm of every aspect of creation. And just as the original intention of creation was God should dwell on the terrestrial level, but because it became putrefied due to Adam's eating of the tree of knowledge and he introduced evil into existence, God says, you will create a microcosm, which is the equivalent of creation, which doesn't have that impurity. And that will be the domicile. Make for me a sanctuary that I should dwell in its midst, that I should dwell in your midst. That's the concept of Mishkan. It's the domicile of God, but that domicile is the equivalent of creation. Betzalel, Talmud tells us, he was endowed with prophecy, divinely inspired, to know exactly how to oversee the building of the Mishkan. I mean, if you would have given the blueprint, like any architect and a construction person could read off the blueprint. There's a blueprint. Why did Betzalel have to be inspired and imbued with divine inspiration, with prophecy, a direct connection? And the Talmud tells us, Betzalel Yodea Litzarif Osios. He knew how to conjugate the letters of the Hebrew alphabet to bring about the energies, the same energies that brought about creation. Because every aspect, every component of the Mishkan had to be infused with a specific intent, which was the same energy which brought about all existence. Because the function of the Mishkan was identically the function of creation. As God was meant to dwell in creation before it was putrefied due to Adam's eating of the tree of knowledge, the Mishkan was the equivalent of that same entity. Therefore, Betzalel had to know how to activate those energies to infuse every component of the Mishkan should be the equivalent of all existence. So God should be able to dwell in that. And that he was imbued by God. So in every letter of the Hebrew language, there's an energy that if you conjugate those letters in a certain way, it brings about energies which are equivalent of creation. You know, in the Kabbalah, that if a person knows how to conjugate, the Rabbi Lutzata speaks about this, it has nothing to do with your spiritual standing or stature. If a person knows how to conjugate certain letters in the Hebrew alphabet, he's able to activate forces which he could perform miracles. He could split oceans. He can do many things. You just have to know, because there's something innate in every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which it's like you have in chemistry, H2O, you have that, and you combine it, you have water. When you combine the various energies which in each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, those energies bring about certain results. And if you know how to conjugate them, it brings about miraculous results, things which are supernatural. The Talmud tells us, I spoke about Tagim, the crowns on the letters. Rabbi Akiva, who was the greatest of the sages in the Tanakh period, the Talmud says that Rabbi Akiva was so great, he's compared to a person who's able to uproot mountains, his genius, and grind them together. You know, could you imagine how powerful? If you uproot two mountains, and you take them and you pulverize them by grinding to turn them into dust. That's how Rabbi Akiva was able to decipher the Torah, to break it down to that degree, to get to the core of the understanding exactly what the Torah was saying in terms of the oral law. He was able to extrapolate from these crowns. The Talmud tells us, Tili Adamas, mounds and mounds of laws. He was able to extrapolate from understanding the representation, the significance of these crowns, which were on the letters. That was Rabbi Akiva. But that's Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now that's the oral law. What's the oral law? The Ramchal explains, as I said, the written law is open for endless interpretations. When God said many things, he meant one thing, or he meant what he said, and he explained what he meant. However, if you don't understand his explanation, his commentary, what he said, it can be interpreted maybe thousands of ways, many ways. But God says, the bedrock of my will is the written law. To understand that, you have to have my commentary. That commentary, which is his commentary, was transmitted to Moshe at Sinai, and that was transmitted to the Jewish people. This is the oral law. It was never committed to writing. So the Ramchal explains that the oral law is known as the tradition, the Masorah. For instance, the Talmud tells us in Kedushin that Jewish marriage, that when you marry a woman, you can marry a number of ways, 3 ways. Either by giving something to her of value, which is minimally worth a penny, and she accepts it in marriage in the presence of 2 qualified witnesses. And the husband, the groom says, the words, which means he says, I am giving this to you in marriage, and you are betrothed to me. And she takes the object of value. It could be a ring, it could be a coin, it could be any object. As long as it has value and she accepts it, she's a married woman. That's one of the ways she's married. She can be married with a document. You write a document, it says, I am marrying so-and-so, and you have a witness, then you give it in the presence of witnesses, she accepts it, she's married. And there's a third way, through cohabitation. If a man goes and he engages with the woman for the sake of marriage through cohabitation, she's his wife, and she's considered a married woman. She's off limits. She's exclusively his unless he terminates the relationship, which can only be terminated through the writ of divorce, what we call in Hebrew a get. That's the only way that relation can be terminated. Now, the Talmud asks, how do we know a woman can be married with money? So it cites a verse, and this is throughout the Talmud, meaning the oral law was given at Sinai. Marriage means ABC. Acquisition is deed, money, or some other way. That's how you acquire fixed property. So the laws were given. The responsibility and the obligation of studying Torah is, how do we take the oral law and show how it's sourced from the written law? That's the study of Torah. You can know the whole oral law, but if you don't understand how it connects to the written law, so how do we extrapolate it? And why must it be this and it can't be anything else? That's the mitzvah of the study of Torah, to make the connection between the oral and the written. Because the oral law is tradition. That's what we call Masorah. That was transmitted. Now, the obligation is, how do we connect? How do we know that this means this and doesn't mean something else? You know, of all blessings, the only blessing that everybody agrees upon, which is a Torah blessing, is what we call Birchas Hamazon, grace after meals. If you eat any one of the 5 grains and you eat it to a sated point, the Torah says you must acknowledge God for that satiation. It says, Vochalta v'savota uvirachto. You eat, you'll be sated, you must bless God. That's what we call Birchas Hamazon, the benching. Everybody agrees, if you eat to a sated point, there's a Torah obligation to acknowledge God for that satiation. There's a question, one other blessing, it may be a Torah obligation, it's called Birchas HaTorah, that before you study Torah, you must say a blessing. That blessing of Birchas HaTorah, although all other blessings on mitzvahs are rabbinical, but this particular blessing is a doraisa, is a Torah obligation. Now, what is the text of Birchas HaTorah? Like every bracha we say on a mitzvah, we say, Asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. You've sanctified us with your mitzvos and you commanded us, l'niach tefillin, to put on tefillin, to wrap yourself in the talis, to eat matzah, whatever it may be. But there's an unusual and very unusual language we say when we say the blessing on before studying Torah. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. If you would be writing the text awry, what would you say? Asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu lilmod Torah, to study Torah. In Hebrew, to study means lilmod, to study. But that's not the text that we have in tradition that was authored by the men of the High Assembly. They authored the text of all the blessings. The text is la'asok b'divrei Torah, to engage in Torah. Doesn't say to study, to engage. The mitzvah is engagement. So everybody has a question. If the mitzvah is Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, why did Chazal, the Ashkenaz Agdol, the men of the High Assembly, why did they choose the word to engage in Torah, not to study Torah, if the mitzvah is to study Torah? That's the question which is asked. So the Maharal of Prague says a beautiful, beautiful answer, which it's definitely correct without a question, because you'll hear the answer in a second. Now, person goes to study, and he's studying in depth. and he comes upon something very difficult. He's already working on it for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. He hasn't resolved the question. So you say to the person, by the way, what have you learned in the past 2 weeks? He says, the truth is I've been struggling on this question. I have no resolution. I have no clarity. I'm really confounded. So the person says, so what did you accomplish? If the mitzvah is studying to be knowledgeable, you're not knowledgeable. You've been spinning your wheels for weeks. And you come home, your wife asks you when you get home, so what new insights did you have? He says, I have no new insights. I'm even more confounded today than yesterday because I realize it's even more difficult than I thought it was. So what is the mitzvah? But if it's a mitzvah of studying Torah, which is knowledge, there's no acquisition of knowledge. Mitzvah of Talmud Torah is not knowledge. It's the process to come upon truth. Nobody's born a genius. The moment you sit down, you understand. It takes time, even if you figure it out in an hour. So until you come to the end of that hour, what have you been doing? You're engaging in the process. That engagement, even though it took an hour to come to the conclusion, what's the value of that hour prior to that conclusion? The hour before you come upon clarity. It has value. What's the value? The value is that's Talmud Torah. The process to come upon the truth of Torah, that is the mitzvah of studying Torah. Therefore, Chazal, the men of the High Assembly, who authored the text, all the blessings, is la'asok b'divrei Torah. The mitzvah is to engage in the study of Torah. It's an engagement. So even though you haven't come upon anything for weeks, but as long as you're applying yourself responsibly and you're not wasting your time, although you have no clarity yet, but when you have clarity and it leads to clarity, that process is the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The two things, there's the study of Torah and you have to be knowledgeable in Torah. It's two separate mitzvahs. But the study of Torah is what I'm saying. We say in the blessing, right before the Shema, the blessing starts, Ava Rabba Avtanu. Ava Rabba Avtanu, you've shown us tremendous love. And we say to God, to have mercy on us. Avinu Ava Rachman. The Father, who's the Father of mercy. This is the blessing right before the Shema. Avinu Ava Rachman. Rachim Oleinu. Have pity on us. Have mercy on us. In what way? The same b'libeinu lahavin lahaskil lishmod l'malamid. Put in our hearts the ability, give us the capacity, lahavinu lahaskil, to understand and to comprehend. Lishmoa, to understand, lishma velasos, to be able to retain it, to be able to communicate it, to be able to disseminate it. We're asking God to help us. What do you need special help? You got a good mind, apply yourself, you'll understand it. No. Avinu Avrach, Rachim Oleinu, have mercy upon us. Give us, put in our hearts the ability, lahavin, to understand and to comprehend. Lishmoya, to hear it. Lilmod Lame, to study it and to disseminate it. Lishmor, to retain it. Lasos, and actualize it. We say this every morning. Every morning, the blessing which precedes the Shema. Meaning, so what is the process? The process is engagement. You engage, you apply yourself. And we're asking God to help us, give us this assistance, the divine assistance, to be able to come upon its truth at many levels, to understand it, to comprehend it, to study it, to disseminate it, to actualize it, to retain it, all these various levels, because that's not within our capacity. Our capacity is we apply ourselves. We engage, but the result of an engagement, that's all up to God. How it's gonna come to fruition. What's gonna be the end result of that? Now, it's interesting. During World War II, there was a secret project. It was called the Manhattan Project. I think it was done under the in the University of Chicago, under the football field, there was a secret laboratory where all this leading physicists were working on the atom bomb. That's where they were. That was known as the Manhattan Project. Did they discover it immediately? There was a group of the most intelligent, advanced physicists, nuclear physicists, whatever, working on this, working on it unceasingly day and night. They had the greatest capacity to have relevance to come upon it. You mean to say you guys were sitting in this dungeon chamber for weeks, racking your brains out, wasting your time? That's called wasting our time. That if we apply ourselves long enough and sufficiently enough, we may come to develop a means of deterrent, a weapon which will save endless lives, although it may destroy endless lives. L'avdil. You didn't say these people wasting their time. This was the elite of humanity, the intelligentsia of humanity. What are you doing in yeshiva? You're sitting, what are you doing there? Shaking over the books. You get involved in all these discussions. They're totally inane. They have no value. I remember there were two people. They visited with me Yerushalayim, and I walked into the Mir Yeshiva. There's a yeshiva in Jerusalem called Mir, because there was a city Mir in Poland, and the one who headed the yeshiva pre-World War II, he had transferred the yeshiva to Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem. And today there are about 8,000 students there. And they have multiple Botei Medrash study halls, maybe 10,000 students. And I took these two young men. They weren't exactly trained in yeshiva circles. And basically, you walk into this room, there are 1,500 people studying face to face. Each person has a study partner. They all basically are dressed the same way: white shirt, dark pair of pants, and they're not wearing their jackets. They're all in shirt sleeves. And it sounds like pandemonium. There's a screaming, people are arguing, fighting, this and that. You can't understand how people could understand what the other one is saying. But if you go and you sit down, each person is engaged in his own particular discussion. He's fully involved there. He's not distracted by anybody else's discussion. And the only time he listens to somebody else's discussion, if that person becomes part of the discussion. They're like amazed. And this is the process through which you come back upon the truth of Torah. The dialogue, the give and take, the questioning. Simultaneously having the commentators and doing an analysis, whether it's the Gemara, the commentaries, Rambam, whatever it may be, it doesn't make a difference. And they come out of there invigorated. And when they come to a level of clarity, they feel every moment was worthwhile. That's lasso b'nei Torah. Based on what we just read in last week's parsha, when the Jews were traveling, this is the 40th year between two mountains. The Amorites, they said, when the Jews come between the mountains, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take these boulders, throw it down on them, and kill them. Kill all the Jews. So what happened? These mountains initially were one mountain, and the mountain split. So what happened when it split? Like pieces of stone were torn out of one side. So you had protrusions on one side, and you had caves, cavernous caves in the other one. So there were, and some sides, one side you had protrusions, the other side you had protrusions, and if you put the mountains together, the protrusions would go into the cave, and if anything was in the cave, it would get crushed, would be ground, be pulverized. So here they're waiting in these caves on both sides. They're waiting for the Jews to come through the pass, and they have these boulders. They're going to throw it down on them. And we know that when we traveled in the desert, there was a cloud that traveled before us. What was the function of that cloud? When the Jews traveled for 40 years, there was never an incline, there was never an elevation. Everything was flat. There were never scorpions, there were never snakes, there were never briars, there were never bush, nothing. It burnt up everything. They had a clear path. If there was a mountain, the mountain was flattened. What happened over here? They come here. The cloud is going. You know what the cloud caused? These mountains joined. When these mountains joined, the protrusions on one side went into the cave on the other side, and the protrusions on the other side went in. So the people who hide in these caves with these boulders, they were ground and crushed to death. That was the miracle. But the Jews had to know about this miracle. How do you know? Hashem did something to make them aware what he did for them. The wellspring of Miriam, which we had, Hashem caused it to go up into the mountains after the mountains separated and go into these caves and to literally wash out these caves of all the remains of the human beings that were dismembered and crushed literally into small pieces. And all of a sudden the Jews notice what's flowing through the camp, this wellspring like a river, endless remains of human beings. And they only realized then that God performed the miracle on their behalf, this unbelievable miracle. And they said a song. It was called the Song of the Bear, the Song of the Well, of the Wellspring. Because this wellspring revealed the miracle that Hashem provided on their behalf, that how the enemy was killed and crushed miraculously. So there it says a term. And then we went and we fought against the giants. And the term is Esves V'Sufa. So the Talmud tells us in Kedushin, which is the tractate that studies the laws of marriage and betrothal, it says when people study in Torah, initially when they're engaged fiercely in this dialogue, it's like they're arch enemies. They're fighting, each one's fighting for his life. But ultimately, when they come to a resolution, they become beloved friends. Initially, when you're going against one another, it's like enemies. That's how fierce the disagreement is. But when you finally come to resolution, you embrace the person, he becomes your intimate friend. Because what are they both looking for? We only want to know truth. You say this is truth, I say that's truth. And if I say what you have is not truth, I do whatever I can to secure myself and dispute your position and refute your position. But when they both come to an understanding of what truth is, because they're both looking only for one thing, for truth. So when they come upon truth, Nasim Ovim Zelda, they become beloved friends, the two of them. But what's the process? The process Lasut B'Divrei Torah. It's the engagement. How do you come to the truth of Torah? You got to apply yourself. You have to engage. You have to toil. And only after all that, then you come upon its truth. Many years ago, there was a person, this is what we were on 61st Street, many years ago. It must have been about 38 years ago. We renovated a small space. And the person came, dropped in. He lived on a farm outside of Albany. And he comes and he sits in a Talmud class for half an hour. And he says to me, he wasn't observant at the time, he was traditional at best. And he must have been then maybe 40 years old, maybe less, 35 years old. And he says to me, he says, I've been coming to New York, came from a very wealthy family. They were in the textile business. His father lived there was a hotel it still is, on Madison. It was called Delmonico Hotel. Delmonico, that's where his father lived. And he would come in from Albany, outside of Albany, to work with his father. And he says, when I'm in New York all week, I go to a class at nighttime, and it's called Chabura. They get together and they discuss Jewish concepts. They know, they're very smart people, but there's no sources. It's all consideration. Do you consider this? Do you consider this? Philosophy, different things. And he's already going for maybe 3-4 years. Whenever he visits New York, spends a number of hours a night going to this group of intellectuals. They discuss all Jewish concepts. He says, I came to this one class for half an hour. I learned more in this half an hour than I learned all the endless hours that I spent, with all this philosophizing, intellectualizing, all this deal. Yeah. The mitzvah is to engage if the engagement brings you to truth. If the engagement brings you to nowhere, you understand? That's called then you're going in circles. The mitzvah is when you study the text, the written law and the oral law, you don't understand it immediately. You have to apply yourself. But if you engage as the Torah prescribes you should engage, and you have an interest of coming upon truth, and you are worthy to come upon that truth, Hashem will give you that truth. That's the mitzvah of studying Torah. Engaging to come upon truth. Therefore, the text is lasuk b'divrei Torah, engaging in the process, not the knowledge. The knowledge is a result of the process.